What is going on, my telegeographers? This is Mr. Majewski. This is my homie, Mr. Guinness, right? Our co-teacher, who's taking a little siesta directly behind me here. You can probably see him just to the right of my arm. But here I am. I'm here to talk about a little religious vocab, like I told you I would. As we move towards the unit exam here, it's important that I go through these terms with you. I'm going to go super fast because, quite frankly, I've got other things that I need to do as well. So let's get to it. 1, Abrahamic faiths. Well, the Abrahamic faiths are the 3 religions that trace their origin back to the founder of the Jews, Abraham. So obviously that's Judaism, right? Abraham is the father of the Jews. He's the man that unites the Jewish tribes for the first time. That would include Christianity, of course, because Christianity develops out of Judaism. Remember, Jesus was a Jew, and really the only difference is the prophet situation here, right? Jews believe prophet hasn't come yet. Christians believe it's Jesus. Muslims believe, of course, that it is Muhammad, and that's why they too are an Abrahamic faith as well. So again, the 3 religions of the Middle East, right, or at least that originated there. The 3 religions that all trace their origins back to Abraham. That's why we call them the Abrahamic faiths, and that's why they have so much actually in common with one another. Number 2 is agnosticism. Anything to add, Mr. Guinness, back there? No, it sounds like you're just snoring. Anyways, agnosticism. If you are agnostic, okay, let me start if you're an atheist, because that's number 4 anyways. If you're an atheist, you believe there is no God, all right? You believe it's all fictitious, all right? If you are agnostic, you're not really exactly sure whether there's a God or not. There might be a God, there might not be a God, you don't know. And so you're not an all-believer, and you're not an atheist, you're somewhere in the middle, all right? There are more agnostics than atheists in the world. These are 2 examples of non-religiousness or irreligiousness. Of course, somebody that's just not interested in religion would also fall into that category as well. Agnostics, we're not totally sure, and atheists generally believe there isn't one at all. Okay? Let's go to number 3 now, animism. All right, an animist is usually somebody that practices, it's a type of ethnic religion, it's an ancient religion, it's a religion that's still practiced today by, for instance, indigenous people in many places. It's generally a belief in inanimate objects as symbolizing or having higher power. Now, this could mean mountains or rocks or other physical landscape that is given specific or significant spiritual significance. So again, think of like volcanoes, maybe in Polynesian societies throughout history, and how they were oftentimes supposed to be almost like the acts of God or God himself. Think about rock formations or Great Lakes that have special significance to particular native populations. In some instances, some people would argue that it also means like a worship in particular animals, like jaguars or panthers or snakes, as giving them special spiritual significance and worshiping them, like some native tribes in Central America and in tropical locations do. But strictists would say that it needs to be an inanimate object and giving it human or spiritual qualities. All right, so anyways, that's animism. It's obviously an example of a folk or an ethnic religion. And yeah, it's not practiced as nearly as much as it used to be when it was much more commonplace. Number 5, autonomous religion. An autonomous religion is the opposite of a hierarchical one. An autonomous religion basically is not structured, or there's not a very ordered setup to that particular faith. So there may not be anybody in charge at the top. It may be very dispersed as a religion, where each individual church is given a great deal of authority or power over itself instead of being a part of an actual organizational structure. Oftentimes it means messages by and control of an individual church are more independent, like they are able to really spread their own messages more often. rather than sticking to particular messages that all churches within that organization might adhere to. So it's really just a question of how a church is controlled, or how strictly controlled it is by the higher body of the organization who make decisions. Autonomous, not very controlled, much more independent, much more widespread, and usually, again, much less rigid or structured. Anyways, let's go to number 6, a branch. So a branch of a religion is a group within a religion that has particular beliefs or practices that distinguish it slightly from other groups within that religion. They still believe in the same overall faith. They still believe in the same overall gods. They still practice, usually the same sort of, they read the same materials. They consider those to be sacred. In many ways, they adhere to similar customs, but there are some religious differences, maybe in terms of certain rituals that are done by one group and not another, that distinguish them enough, and also the geography of where they're located is dispersed enough or able to be studied enough that we call those a different branch from one another. So again, in Christianity, we're talking about Protestant branch versus Catholic versus Orthodox Christian. In Islam, we're talking about Sunni Islam versus Shia Islam. And then obviously in Buddhism, we're talking about the 3 types there. Mahayana, which is generally considered by many to be more kind of strict, and what you would expect when Buddha really wanted folks to kind of suffer in order to achieve enlightenment. Then there's one called Theravada, which is generally a little bit more easy to practice. And so those would be the 2 major branches that you would want to know for Buddhism as well. Let's get to caste. Remember, caste is a social class within Indian society, and it was very much supportive of and supported by the Hindu faith. Remember, the idea with the caste system is that you're born into it. It's very difficult to ever get out of that. It really determines education, marriage, job expectations, and really, to be honest with you, it really very much can control your entire rest of your life. Hindu society is designed to really support the idea that you are reincarnated, and depending on how well you live this life, it can move you to a higher or potentially a lower caste. So it's very much a part of Hindu faith, and it absolutely dominated Indian society for thousands of years, at least the Hindu portions of it. More recently, the government has tried to get rid of it and or lessen caste requirements in many places, but oftentimes that's difficult to do. There's oftentimes protest against changes the government tries to make to end caste systems. And of course, in more rural or isolated areas, the caste system oftentimes remains very vibrant. It still continues on almost as if it were ancient times. Number 8 is cosmogony. Cosmogony is a belief in how the world was created, a theory or a belief as to how the world was created. Most monotheistic religions have one, and usually it is centered around an individual god, a monotheistic god, creating the world, creating the universe, and creating Earth as part of it. Some religions do not have cosmogony. Buddhism is a good example of a religion that does not. Confucianism doesn't really have a cosmogony either. And that's, of course, why they oftentimes are much more easy to blend with other religions that might. All right? By the way, ethnic native societies, they usually do have a cosmogony, but it's usually an example of how, humans and nature, or gods and nature, work together to create this speck of Earth that we all live on today. Anyways, let's get to 9, denomination. So a denomination is an individual religion within a particular branch. So what that would mean is, again, it's a religion, an individual religion, a denomination is, that's part of a particular branch. So a denomination is, again, going to probably have other religions, other denominations, I should say, that are very similar to it, with maybe slight differences practiced. The most obvious example here is Protestantism. Protestantism has dozens and dozens of different religions that are considered Protestant, and so the Protestant branch has a bunch of individual denominations within it that all believe slightly different things from one another. Now, they're similar enough and different from Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity to be all placed within the same branch. But there might be individual differences in terms of everyday practice, or, again, certain activities and or certain beliefs that distinguish these Protestant faiths enough from one another where they are considered separate denominations. Number 10, diffusion of Buddhism. Well, remember, Buddhism spread originally primarily by trade. It was founded in northern India, in a place called Nepal, which is technically northern India, but today it's its own country. It spread throughout India first, and then with Indian traders, took it through into Indonesia and into Southeast Asia. And, of course, it settled in Southeast Asia and eventually into East Asia, including China and Japan. So trade has been the primary means by which Buddhism has spread. Obviously, in more modern times, it has been spread by missionary activity, particularly also by the movement of people Buddhists to other portions of the world, not necessarily for religious reasons. Number 11 is the diffusion of Christianity. So that is really the explanation for Buddhism. Let's move on to 11, diffusion of Christianity again. That is obviously the hearth area for Christianity is Judea or Israel, right? Jerusalem and Bethlehem specifically. Bethlehem is where Jesus is born. Jerusalem is where most of the story takes place. And it diffuses obviously throughout southern Europe, kind of the Mediterranean area, in small, slow, steady steps after the death of Jesus. And that's primarily by missionary activity by his apostles and by early believers. Then, of course, the major reason for the spread of Christianity into all of Europe, or in at least much of it, is the conversion of the Roman Empire, Augustine, who converts over to Christianity hundreds of years after, interestingly enough, the Romans were responsible for his death. And that, of course, causes almost all of the Roman Empire to follow in suit to their emperor, and that leads to its spread to Europe. Now, obviously, it then spreads to North and South America as a result of European colonization. And then, of course, it spreads into portions of Africa for the same reason. Eventually, it spreads into Oceania, again for the same reasons, primarily colonization by the English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And I should also mention the Dutch for that matter. Anyways, number 12, by the way, Christianity, is the largest religion in the world. And it's very much a universalizing faith because of its diffusion. 12, diffusion of Islam. Well, if Buddhism spread primarily from trade and Christianity primarily from missionary activity and the conversion of the Roman Empire followed by colonization, Islam has spread primarily because of conquest. Islam developed in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, about 600 AD. Early Muslim leaders in the area who had converted and ordered the conversion of their followers, they quickly expanded outward in nearly all directions. They were led by the Ottomans, who were in Turkey, and they gobbled up large amounts of territory in North Africa, all of the Middle East, even up into Europe, not only from Spain, but also Europe through Southern Europe. And so Islam spread rapid fire, largely because of conquest, and that helps to explain its distribution today. Now, again, like most others, its primary means of diffusion today is missionary activity, particularly in North Africa, as Muslims spread into Central Africa, attempting to continue its spread there. Also, efforts to expand Islam into Central and Southeast Asia. Anyway, so we got to keep on moving before Mr. M loses his voice here. Number 13 is an ethnic religion. Okay. Ethnic religions are pretty easy. So an ethnic religion is a religion that is not widely dispersed. It's relatively concentrated. They're usually ancient or very, very old. They have no particular founder, unlike a universalizing faith. And they are much generally more connected to the area where they were founded, which means landscapes, areas of importance, sacred spaces are generally located in that area, which means most of their practitioners are there. They do not actively attempt to convert people, so they don't send missionaries out for the most part. Oftentimes, ethnic faiths, you are born into it. That's to name just a few of the differences. And let's move on to 14, fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the idea that your religion fundamentally affects your behavior and decision-making on a day-to-day basis. So if you use religion, or if religion is so important to you that it almost controls much of the decision-making in your day-to-day lives, then that is called fundamentalism. Now, we oftentimes associate fundamentalism with extremist terrorists, for instance, extremist Muslim terrorists, or religious terrorists, like, for instance, Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, where folks are committing extreme attacks in the name of fundamentalism or in the name of their religion. It could also, though, for instance, if religion is really going to control decision-making, it could also sometimes be used against folks like, conservative Christians who potentially vote based on religion over any other factor at play. Although I think when we're really talking about fundamentalism, we're talking about extreme fundamentalism in this class. 15 is ghetto. Remember, we were able to skip over that because it is a duplicate. And remember, it's under the ethnicity unit, so you do not have to cover it as part of these terms. 16, hierarchical religion. Well, it's the opposite of a autonomous one. Hierarchical religions are religions that have a really usually rigid power structure or system of decision-making in place. There's a great deal more control from where the central location of that religion, for instance, Vatican City and the Pope in Catholicism. They have a great deal of control over messaging, over decision-making about, for instance, the size of congregations, where new churches are going to be constructed. Really, it's that central location that makes most of the major decisions that affect that faith. It's really the opposite of autonomous, again, which is much more kind of independent decision-making from church to church to church. Again, Catholicism is a good example of a hierarchical faith. And the best way to probably look at that geographically is the fact that they do not open new Catholic churches without a great deal of study, without a great deal of anticipation of where needs will be. So they have a great deal of control over those sorts of decisions. Another good example is the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints. They run a very rigid decision-making system out of Salt Lake City, which is where the church elders are located. They have a great deal of control in terms of the messages that their individual churches have and send, and they can really organize and unify their people religiously, especially when it comes to things like voting or getting out and making their voices heard. So again, hierarchical faiths have their strengths. Some would argue they have their weaknesses, that they're almost like too much control from one area or one person that's affecting the entire faith. but they do have their positives, and they definitely have some criticisms as well. All right, 17 is a missionary. That's a person whose job it is to go out and actively convert people. They're associated with, again, universalizing faiths in particular. They are associated with Christianity, Islam, Buddhism. 18, monotheism is a belief in a single God. Of course, Jews were the first to believe so. Up until then, all beings were animist and or polytheistic. A major turning point, obviously, because the two largest religions today are both monotheistic. Obviously, it's the kind of the religions of the West, which therefore gives it added significance in countries like our own. Paganism or a pagan was somebody that believed in either multiple gods or they believed in animism before Christianity. It was a term Christians used to describe non-believers in Europe, not necessarily Muslims, but non-believers in Europe that might still hold on to old, outdated beliefs, polytheistic beliefs, or animist faiths. So that's what pagan means. It's kind of an anti-Christian term that was often used by Christians to denigrate others. 20 is pilgrimage. So by the way, the Romans would have been considered pagan by Christians. 20, pilgrimage. Pilgrimage is a religious trip that a person takes back to a particular holy site in keeping with their religious customs. So the obvious examples, again, are with Islam and their pilgrimage to Mecca, which all Muslims are supposed to take. They're supposed to do a Hajj, or do the Hajj, as it's called, take their Hajj to Mecca. In addition to that, Hindus pilgrimage to the Ganges. Of course, again, there are other faiths that will support a pilgrimage. For instance, Jews to the Wailing Wall or Christians to Jerusalem, but it's not necessarily a requirement per se like it is with Islam and Hinduism. 21 is polytheism. That's a belief in multiple gods. Obviously, that was a dominant faith that existed throughout much of ancient history. The Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks were all polytheistic. The Norse, right, with the Vikings, they were polytheistic as well. So it's obviously the Jews are the first major group to make the switch to monotheism. A sect is an individual faith or church that is not connected to any denomination, so therefore it's kind of its own independent facility or independent church. A sect can be strict in terms of its religious interpretation, for instance, very strict evangelical sects, or it could actually be the opposite. It could be very loose with its interpretation and basically be a giant or a mega church that attracts people from widely different Christian backgrounds who kind of support the simple, unifying messages that might be provided. So a sect is independent, it's separate, it's not really a part of any sort of organized denomination or branch. It's usually, for instance, generically like a Christian sect or simply an Islamic sect that might have especially unique views that isolate or separate it, that cause them to choose to want to kind of remain independent from any of the others. 23 is the solstice. Solstice is, again, related to solar events and lunar events, related to where the sun and the moon are in the sky. High and low points are known as summer and winter solstices. Of course, this was a considered an important religious event in many animist faiths and in many early ancient societies. Of course, Stonehenge, great example of that, and of course, these were especially important because of a belief in the agricultural seasons and all of those things. So therefore, the solstice had important significance. Syncretic means that a religion blends with another religion. Sometimes it's used to describe language as well, but a syncretic religion, for instance, like Christianity, would blend with, Santeria in the Caribbean, or with ancient African traditions in Central Africa. So it just means that religions that blend together, or that are more likely or able to. 25, the three branches of Buddhism. Of course, you've got Mahayana, which I've already described. It's kind of a slightly more strict version of Buddhism. Of course, you've got the Theravadas, Okay, so again, Mahayana is popular more in East Asia. Theravada popular in Southeast Asia, and that's the one that's probably closer to like the original Buddhism that existed, that was practiced by Buddha. Usually a little stricter and a little bit more serious, I guess, in terms of its interpretation, whereas the others are a little bit more focused on the positive and easier to practice. All right. Anyways, again, Theravada, Mahayana, and then Rajavaira is what it's called. That is like the super kind of hippie-ish version of Islam, of Buddhism, which is kind of more along the lines of like meditation and yoga and those sorts of things. All right, so really focus on the first two. If you're going to focus on branches of Buddhism beyond just knowing their names. 26, three branches of Christianity. You should know this: Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic. Remember, all Christians originally were Catholics. Then about 1000 A.D., the Eastern Orthodox religions kind of broke away. They formed their own church with their own pope. They spoke different languages than the Latin that was being spoken in Rome. And so they kind of wanted to break away and to institute basic changes to some of the rituals that were practiced still by the Roman Catholics. So again, there's that split between Eastern Orthodoxy. It becomes real popular in Eastern Europe versus Catholicism, which was popular throughout all the rest of Europe. And then, of course, about 1500, we get the Protestant Reformation, where Protestant religions break away from the Catholic Church one after the other over claims of abuse and corruption and overuse of power by the Catholic Church against members and against churches. So today we have three branches. Of course, the Protestant branch is strong in the northernest portions of Europe. And then obviously most of Southern and Western Europe, along with much of Central Europe, remains Catholic. So again, you do have religious breakdown in Europe over between those three faiths. Eastern Orthodox and strongest in the East, Protestantism strongest in the northern states, and of course Catholicism strongest everywhere else. Obviously, in the United States, we have slight differences. We have a lot more Protestants in the United States than we do Catholics. However, because Protestants are broken up into so many different denominations, there are still technically more Roman Catholics than there are any individual Protestant faith. Anyways, the Protestant faiths are generally the strongest in the South and in the Midwest. Catholicism is strong in the Southwest and in the Northeast, thanks to immigration historically from Ireland and also more recently from Latin America. And then, of course, you have Central and South America, which are overwhelmingly Catholic. 27, two branches of Islam. Those would be Sunni and Shia. Of course, Sunnis believe that basically anybody ought to be the leader of the religion, an imam, whereas Shiites believe that people that can trace their descendancy back to Muhammad ought to be the leaders of the faith. Of course, Sunni Islam is much, much more practiced than Shia Islam, about 85 to 15%. Of course, places like Iran are where most of the Shiites in the world are concentrated. Much of the rest of the world, in fact, almost all of the rest of the Muslim world in North Africa, the Middle East, and into Asia is Sunni. 28, universalizing religions, again, are the opposite of ethnic ones. They generally are associated with a founder. They're generally monotheistic. They generally use important events in their faith based on the founder's life and founder's behavior. They are generally very widespread around the world. They actively use missionaries in order to recruit new folks into their faiths. Universalizing. They're universal. They're worldwide, which is partly why they have their name. Okay, that is going to do it for Mr. M, because my voice is struggling. Good luck. I hope that helped. And have a wonderful